The day the truth came out, Meghan Markle's world changed forever. What if I told you that the story you've believed about Prince Archie's birth, the moment that captured hearts across the globe, wasn't the whole truth? That behind the smiles, the carefully staged photographs, and the carefully worded press statements, there was a secret so explosive that it threatened to shake the very foundation of the royal family? Imagine sitting there, trying to hold on to a perfect narrative, only to discover that the life you've presented to the world was built on a lie. How would you feel? What would you do if your own mother held the key to a revelation that could unravel everything? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all began quietly, in a way that no one outside a small circle could have predicted. Meghan's mother, Doria Ragland, a woman known for her discretion and calm composure, had been carrying a weight of knowledge, a weight of truth that no one, not even King Charles, had ever been prepared to hear. And when she finally decided to speak, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. Meghan, usually so composed under scrutiny, was found in tears, a rare and vulnerable sight for the public eye. But what exactly did Doria reveal? Why did it shock Meghan, her family, and ultimately, the monarchy? The story of Prince Archie's birth had always been portrayed as intimate, private, and deeply personal. The world saw Meghan, radiant and glowing, cradling her newborn son in the hospital, the media buzzing with excitement, the public enraptured by the fairy tale images of a new generation of royals. Behind those smiles, however, there were questions that very few dared to ask, and even fewer expected to be answered. Questions about secrecy, about surrogacy, and about the lengths one might go to protect a family image. And then, one day, Doria revealed the truth that no one could have anticipated. Meghan had used a surrogate for Archie, and this had been hidden not just from the public, but from the entire royal family, including King Charles himself. Think about that for a moment. Every announcement, every public appearance, every carefully managed photograph had been part of a narrative that was incomplete, if not entirely misleading. The implications were staggering. The monarchy, an institution built on centuries of tradition, protocol, and public trust, had just been confronted with a truth that could disrupt everything. How would the royal family react? How would King Charles respond to a revelation that not only challenged the story of his grandson's birth, but also placed Meghan at the center of a carefully guarded secret? But before we get to that, let's rewind for a moment. To truly understand the magnitude of this revelation, you have to understand the context in which it happened. Meghan's journey to motherhood had been watched, scrutinized, and celebrated by millions around the world. Her pregnancy with Archie was framed as a miracle, a new chapter in a fairy tale that the public wanted to believe in. Fans around the globe followed every ultrasound announcement, every hospital trip, every carefully curated Instagram post. And yet, while the world was captivated by this narrative, the undercurrents of secrecy, fear, and strategic planning were swirling behind the scenes. Doria Ragland had been there every step of the way, a pillar of support and guidance for her daughter. She had seen Meghan navigate the treacherous waters of royal life, balancing public expectations, media scrutiny, and personal aspirations. And yet, there was something Meghan had kept even from her mother, a decision that would eventually bring Doria to a breaking point. The surrogate arrangement, hidden from everyone, including the monarchy, was not just a personal choice. It was a secret that, if revealed, could upend family dynamics, public perception, and the carefully maintained image of the royal household. Can you imagine the weight of that secret? Living with a truth so explosive that it could redefine relationships and reputations, yet carrying it silently, day after day, knowing that a single misstep could cause irreparable damage. That was the position Doria found herself in, and it was only a matter of time before she decided that silence was no longer an option. But what drove her to finally speak? Was it love for her daughter? A moral duty to the family? Or a belief that the monarchy deserved to know the truth? When Doria finally spoke, the timing was everything. The palace, already navigating complex family dynamics and public scrutiny, was blindsided by the revelation. Meghan, confronted with the reality that her mother had gone public, or at least communicated the truth to King Charles, was overcome with emotion. It was a moment of vulnerability rarely seen by the public, a moment that revealed the human cost of secrecy and deception. Watching Meghan break down, it was clear that this was more than just a scandal. It was a personal reckoning, an emotional upheaval that had been years in the making. And then there was King Charles. How does a father respond when the story of his grandson's birth, the heir who represents the continuity of the monarchy, is suddenly revealed to be different from what he believed? The private meeting between Charles and Doria, the tension, the confusion, and the silent judgment that must have filled the room. These are moments that would define not just Meghan's narrative, but the narrative of the entire royal family. In a single revelation, centuries of tradition and expectation collided with personal secrets and human emotion. As we unpack this story, it's important to remember the stakes. This isn't just about Meghan and a surrogate. It's about trust, loyalty, deception, and the high cost of secrecy in one of the most scrutinized families in the world. Every detail, every whisper, every hidden truth carries weight. And as we explore the aftermath, the private confrontations, the palace maneuvering, the media frenzy, you'll see how a single revelation can ripple outward, affecting relationships, reputations, and the very perception of reality. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be part of a family where every move is watched, every word dissected, and every secret carries the potential to explode publicly? That's the world Meghan and her mother inhabit, and the choices they make are amplified in ways that most of us can scarcely imagine. The surrogate revelation isn't just a private matter. It's a seismic event that shakes the core of the royal narrative, challenges public trust, and forces every member of the family to confront uncomfortable truths. But the story doesn't stop there. Because while the world saw Meghan in tears, what you didn't see were the behind-the-scenes conversations, the whispered judgments, and the strategic decisions that followed. The palace staff, advisors, and even distant relatives were suddenly entangled in a secret they had never anticipated. The ripple effects would extend far beyond the initial revelation, reaching media outlets, social platforms, and the public consciousness. Everyone wanted answers, and no one knew exactly how the family would respond. And here's the twist that sets the stage for everything to come. The revelation about the surrogate was just the beginning. The implications for the royal line, for Harry's role in the family, and for Meghan's public image were enormous. And yet, in the chaos of emotion, secrecy, and media speculation, one fact stood out above all. The monarchy had been kept in the dark. A secret so critical, so personal, that it redefined the way the family would view loyalty, transparency, and trust. By the end of this story, you'll see how Meghan's tears were not just about personal fear, but about the profound consequences of choices made in secrecy. You'll witness the emotional fallout, the private confrontations, and the public spectacle that followed. You'll understand why this revelation is so important, not just for Meghan, Harry, and King Charles, but for anyone who has ever wondered what happens when family secrets collide with public life. And as we begin this journey, one question remains. What happens next when the most private truth is exposed to those who hold the most power? What comes after the tearful confessions, the whispered confrontations, and the hidden surrogacy arrangements? And most importantly, how does a family, a monarchy, and a global audience react when the story they thought they knew turns out to be far from the whole truth? The answer to these questions is what we're about to explore. And believe me, what Doria revealed next, the part that Meghan never expected, would leave everyone in the palace stunned and the world watching in disbelief. But we won't reveal that just yet. That bombshell is coming, and when it does, it will redefine everything you thought you knew about Prince Archie's birth and Meghan Markle's role in the royal family. Because the moment Doria spoke, Meghan's tears were only the beginning. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have the life you carefully built unravel in a single moment? That was Meghan Markle's reality the day Doria revealed the secret about Archie's birth. The tears, the trembling hands, the sudden panic. It wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about the very foundation of her story being exposed. How do you maintain control over your narrative when someone you love and trust has just told the truth behind closed doors? That question hung heavy in the palace air, thick and suffocating. The birth of Prince Archie had been presented to the world as an event of joy and celebration. Photographs of Meghan cradling her baby, glowing and serene, had been shared across newspapers, websites, and social media feeds globally. Headlines hailed the moment as a new chapter for the monarchy, an emblem of hope and modernity. But behind those smiling faces, there had been whispers, hushed conversations, and unanswered questions. Some palace insiders had noticed that certain arrangements didn't quite fit the standard royal narrative. Some subtle inconsistencies. But no one, absolutely no one, expected the truth to be what Doria disclosed. It was not merely a matter of secrecy. It was a matter of timing, optics, and personal choice. The use of a surrogate, the careful orchestration of every public appearance, and the meticulously managed media coverage were all intended to protect Meghan, Harry, and their child. To the public, everything appeared perfect. But perfection, as we know, often masks the deepest fractures. Have you ever felt compelled to protect a secret so intensely that you would manipulate reality itself? That was Meghan's world. But let's rewind even further, because understanding the full weight of this revelation requires knowing what led to it. Meghan's journey through the royal family had been anything but smooth. She faced intense scrutiny from the media, relentless public criticism, and, often, the isolating pressures of palace life. Every appearance, every word, and every gesture was dissected, analyzed, and interpreted. And yet, amidst this external pressure, Meghan had also been grappling with personal choices about her family, her child, and the way she wanted her story to unfold. Doria Ragland had been Meghan's anchor throughout these turbulent years. A quiet presence in the background, a source of guidance and support, she had witnessed her daughter navigate the unrelenting pressures of being a royal. She had seen Meghan wrestle with doubt, fear, and guilt. And yet, even Doria had not been fully privy to every decision Meghan made, particularly when it came to the birth of Archie. It was the kind of secret that isn't just about privacy. It's about trust, about honesty, about the very bonds that hold a family together. When those bonds are tested, how far would someone go to protect themselves? And how far would a parent go to reveal the truth? The palace itself had been caught in a delicate balancing act. On one hand, there was the need to maintain the monarchy's image, to protect the family's reputation, and to manage public perception. On the other, there was the human reality, a daughter crying, a mother revealing a secret, a father blindsided by information that upended everything he thought he knew. Imagine being King Charles in that moment. You've dedicated your life to tradition, to protocol, and yet here is a truth that no training, no preparation could have anticipated. How do you respond when the narrative you've been told is suddenly contradicted by the person you trust the most? The initial reaction in the palace was a mixture of shock and disbelief. Meghan, vulnerable and teary-eyed, could barely process what was happening. Doria, calm yet resolute, had made it clear that the surrogate revelation was not a matter of scandal, it was a matter of truth. She had chosen to tell King Charles privately, understanding the impact it would have on both her daughter and the royal household. But the private nature of the revelation did little to lessen its weight. Every word carried consequence, every pause a silent judgment. It's worth asking, why had Meghan felt the need to conceal the use of a surrogate in the first place? Part of it, undoubtedly, was the pressure of public expectation. Royal births are steeped in tradition and symbolism. The idea of using a surrogate, while increasingly common in broader society, carried potential judgment in a world that prizes lineage and biological continuity. Meghan was navigating an intersection of personal choice and institutional expectation, trying to balance authenticity with the demands of a centuries-old institution. How often do we make decisions that pit our values against the expectations of those around us? Meghan's dilemma was magnified 1,000-fold. And then there was the role of Harry. What did he know? What had he been told? And what had he chosen to believe? Prince Harry, loyal to his wife but also loyal to his family, was in an impossible position. The revelation threatened to upend not only Meghan's story, but also his own. Was he complicit in the secrecy, or was he as blindsided as his father? The palace corridors whispered questions that had no easy answers. Insiders speculated, analysts debated, and the public speculated further. Every interaction, every phone call, every private meeting became a potential flashpoint for conflict. Yet, for all the drama and the speculation, there was something profoundly human at play. Meghan's tears were not only a reaction to embarrassment or fear, they were the manifestation of a deep, existential panic. The realization that her carefully managed narrative could unravel, that her child's public story might no longer align with reality, and that her family's trust was now in question, created an emotional maelstrom. Have you ever felt that combination of fear, regret, and helplessness? That moment when you realize that one choice, made in the hope of protecting someone, has led to consequences you could never have imagined? That was Meghan, right there in the heart of the palace. Meanwhile, Doria Ragland's revelation was not delivered with malice. On the contrary, it was an act of love and moral obligation. She recognized the potential fallout, but she also understood that some truths cannot remain hidden indefinitely. Secrets, after all, have a way of surfacing, whether through leaks, whispers, or inadvertent admissions. By coming forward proactively, Doria was asserting control over the narrative, hoping to mitigate the damage while ensuring honesty. But even the most careful intentions can have unintended consequences, and in this case, the consequences were immediate and profound. Let's consider King Charles for a moment. How must it have felt to learn, in a single private conversation, that the story of his grandson's birth, the heir whose existence symbolized continuity, hope, and legacy, was not as he had believed? His shock would have been accompanied by a torrent of questions. Why was I not told? What does this mean for our family? How do we manage public perception now? And most importantly, how do I support my daughter and my grandchild in a moment where personal emotions collide with institutional duty? The answers were not easy, and the stakes were impossibly high. As Meghan struggled to compose herself, the palace staff and advisors were quietly mobilizing. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle gesture became a part of the unfolding drama. The tension was palpable, not just in the room where Meghan and Doria spoke, but throughout the palace itself. Secrets have a way of creating ripple effects, and in this case, the ripple had already begun to spread. What started as a private conversation between mother and daughter was now a catalyst for broader scrutiny, speculation, and inevitable confrontation. And then there's the public perception. The royal family exists in a delicate balance between tradition and visibility, duty and transparency. When Doria's revelation inevitably reached the media, whether through official channels or the gossip network, the world would see Meghan's tears, but they wouldn't see the private calculations, the whispered counsel, and the emotional weight carried by everyone involved. Have you ever considered how much of a public figure's life is curated, polished, and controlled, only for a single truth to disrupt it all? That disruption is exactly what was about to happen. As the hours passed following Doria's revelation, Meghan faced an internal struggle. The public image she had meticulously constructed was under threat. Her relationship with her husband was put into an intricate balancing act, and her relationship with her family had shifted in ways that could not easily be undone. Every decision, every word, and every gesture mattered more than ever. And all the while, the question loomed: how would the monarchy respond to a secret so profound, a revelation so explosive, that it had the potential to redefine not only personal relationships, but institutional perceptions? The palace remained tense, the corridors thick with whispers, and Meghan's tears were only the beginning of the story. Because in every secret revealed, there lies a second, deeper revelation waiting to emerge. And what Doria disclosed to King Charles, that Archie's birth was via a surrogate and hidden from everyone, was just the first layer of a story that would unfold with shocking complexity, emotional depth, and consequences that no one could have predicted. The stage was set. The players were in place. And the next chapter would reveal not only how Meghan coped with this confrontation, but how the ripple effects began to spread throughout the royal family, the palace staff, and ultimately, the public eye. What came next would test loyalties, expose vulnerabilities, and challenge perceptions in ways that left everyone stunned. Because the truth, once revealed, does not quietly fade. It spreads. It shocks. It changes everything. And for Meghan, the journey from tears to confrontation was only beginning. But what happened next would shake the palace to its core, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever thought about how one day can define a lifetime? For Meghan Markle, that day was the moment Prince Archie was born, or at least, the moment the world believed he was born. From the outside, it seemed like any other royal birth. Bright flashes from cameras, smiling crowds, carefully timed announcements. But behind those polished images, the reality was far more complicated, far more fragile, and far more secretive. The birth of Prince Archie was meant to be a celebration, a reaffirmation of hope for a family under relentless scrutiny. Yet what actually transpired behind palace walls would send shockwaves through the monarchy, shaking traditions and exposing truths no one was prepared to face. It began in the quiet hours of the morning, a day like any other in terms of palace protocol, but unlike any other in terms of emotional weight. Meghan, hours away from being introduced to the world as a mother, had spent the preceding months under immense pressure. Not just the physical demands of pregnancy, but the psychological strain of being under the microscope. Every visit to the doctor, every ultrasound, every conversation with aides was observed, logged, and analyzed. There were moments of joy, yes, but they were interspersed with tension, isolation, and a constant awareness of public scrutiny. Every step had to be precise, every word carefully measured. One misstep, one hint of imperfection, could ignite a media firestorm that would last for weeks. And yet, behind the layers of preparation, there was a secret, one so sensitive that it could not even be whispered aloud. Meghan had chosen, for reasons known only to her and those closest, to use a surrogate. The surrogate arrangement itself was a tightly guarded secret, carefully orchestrated to maintain privacy. The surrogate would deliver the child, but the narrative, crafted for public consumption, would remain that of Meghan carrying Archie herself. To the world, the story was perfect. To the royal family, however, it was incomplete. There were no whispers in the corridors, no hints in the press. Everyone believed what they were told. Everyone, that is, until Doria decided to speak. Doria's intervention would come later, but in these initial moments, the palace operated as it always had, in a dance of formality, expectation, and subtlety. Meghan, aware of the stakes, followed the protocols perfectly. Nurses, aides, and staff observed her every move, documenting the process, ensuring that the story presented to the world would be flawless. It was a choreography perfected over decades of royal tradition. Smiles, poses, gentle movements, each carefully calculated to maintain the image of calm serenity, maternal grace, and seamless continuity. But beneath the calm exterior, Meghan's mind raced. She was balancing fear, anticipation, and the ever-present anxiety that the truth might somehow slip through the cracks. Meanwhile, King Charles and the palace inner circle waited in quiet anticipation. To them, this birth was monumental, not just for the family but for the monarchy itself. Archie represented the future, a continuation of lineage, a symbol of stability amidst global attention. And yet, unbeknownst to them, the foundation on which this narrative was built was different from what they had been told. The palace's well-oiled machinery was about to encounter a complication that no protocol could fully address. What made this birth particularly extraordinary was not the child itself, but the hidden complexities surrounding it. The surrogate, the secrecy, the coordination, all of it created a tension that pulsed beneath the surface, invisible to most but profoundly felt by Meghan and Doria. Imagine living through such a moment, knowing that the narrative presented to the world does not align with reality. Would you feel relief, guilt, pride, or fear? Meghan experienced all of these emotions simultaneously, each amplified by the knowledge that one revelation from the wrong person could unravel everything. In the immediate hours following Archie's birth, the palace followed its usual routine of announcements, photographs, and media releases. The world was fed the curated story. Meghan was a radiant, glowing mother, Harry was a doting father, and Archie was the latest addition to the royal lineage. Headlines declared the birth a triumph. Social media erupted with congratulations, fan theories, and speculation about the child's personality, future, and resemblance to family members. Every channel broadcast the images of Meghan's serene smile, Harry's gentle pride, and the baby cradled with careful hands. To the public, it was a fairy tale. To Meghan, it was a performance layered on top of reality, a delicate facade hiding a personal truth of immense consequence. Even within the palace, reactions were carefully managed. Staff whispered, aides followed procedures, and the inner circle discussed logistics, not personal truths. No one suspected the storm that was about to hit because they had no inkling of the secret that Doria would later reveal. Every action was predicated on maintaining order, on adhering to expectation, and on keeping the carefully constructed narrative intact. And yet, in the quiet spaces, in the pauses between protocol and procedure, tension lingered. The use of a surrogate was not just a private choice. It was a decision loaded with consequence. In a family that relies on lineage, heritage, and the symbolic power of birth, a surrogate introduces questions. Who truly carries the bloodline? How are public appearances reconciled with private arrangements? And what happens when the narrative conflicts with truth? For Meghan, these questions were deeply personal and intensely stressful. She knew that if the secret were exposed prematurely, it could result in personal humiliation, media backlash, and familial disappointment. The stakes were enormous, and the pressure was unrelenting. And then came the moment Doria could no longer remain silent. Imagine the scene. A mother, steadfast and principled, realizing that withholding the truth could have more damaging consequences than revealing it. She made the decision to disclose the surrogate's role in Archie's birth to King Charles, bypassing all intermediaries, aware that her daughter's reaction would be immediate and emotionally charged. What would you do in that situation? Would you protect your child's narrative at all costs, or would you risk temporary conflict to preserve honesty? When Doria spoke, Meghan's carefully constructed world began to unravel. The reaction was instant: tears, trembling, a mix of panic and disbelief. This was not a moment captured for the media, not a photograph to be circulated online. This was real, raw, and profoundly human. The reality of her decision, the secrecy she had maintained, and the implications for her family and the monarchy hit her all at once. Every carefully managed moment of the past months, the public appearances, the interviews, the media-friendly gestures, collapsed under the weight of truth. King Charles's reaction was no less complex. Here was a father, a monarch, and a custodian of tradition, faced with information that challenged both personal and institutional expectations. How do you respond when your daughter has hidden a truth of such magnitude? How do you reconcile love for a child with the responsibility to an institution centuries in the making? The private confrontation between Charles, Meghan, and Doria was tense, deliberate, and fraught with unspoken judgment. Every pause carried meaning, every glance carried weight, and every word spoken had consequences beyond the room itself. As Meghan struggled to regain composure, Doria's explanation was methodical yet compassionate. She detailed the reasons behind the surrogate arrangement, emphasizing privacy, protection, and intention. Yet even as she spoke, the weight of revelation bore down on the room. Meghan's anxiety, Harry's loyalty, Charles's paternal concern, and the palace staff's silent observation created an emotional pressure cooker. The surrogate was not just a matter of childbirth. It was a nexus point for questions about trust, loyalty, secrecy, and the role of narrative in a family constantly under public scrutiny. Even the most seasoned palace observers could not have anticipated the emotional intensity in that room. Meghan's tears were emblematic not just of personal fear, but of the collision between private truth and public expectation. She was a mother, a wife, a daughter, and a public figure, all at once, facing the fallout of a secret that had finally been revealed. Every thought, every breath, every emotion contributed to a maelstrom that would have lasting consequences for the family. Yet, while Meghan grappled with her emotions, one thing became painfully clear. The ripple effects of this revelation were far from contained. Conversations in private chambers, whispers in corridors, and subtle glances among staff hinted at the inevitable fallout. The secret had been exposed to King Charles, but its consequences would extend far beyond that initial disclosure. How would the palace staff handle it? How would other family members react? And most importantly, what would the public think once the truth inevitably surfaced? In the hours following Doria's disclosure, the palace operated as though nothing had changed. Officially, Archie's birth remained the fairy tale event the public had seen. Unofficially, tension simmered beneath every interaction. Meghan navigated her responsibilities as a new mother while processing an emotional revelation. King Charles grappled with how to respond to both his daughter and the implications for the monarchy. And Doria, steadfast in her moral decision, observed the unfolding consequences, aware that her actions would redefine relationships and power dynamics for months, possibly years, to come. And then there were Harry and Meghan's advisors, carefully considering every next step. How to manage the public narrative, how to advise the couple privately, how to navigate a situation in which the monarchy itself had been blindsided. These questions became central to the palace strategy, adding layers of complication and emotional strain to an already volatile situation. But just as the family began to absorb the initial revelation, there was a second layer of complexity. A leak, a whisper, an inadvertent hint, a single detail that threatened to bring the world into the palace's private drama. How do you protect a secret once the people closest to it begin to act independently, each driven by their own priorities, fears, and ambitions? Meghan's tears had been witnessed in private, but could the carefully managed narrative survive if even a fraction of those private conversations made their way into the public sphere? The birth of Prince Archie, already a moment of global attention, had now become something far more complicated, a crucible of emotion, secrecy, and revelation. Meghan's story, the story the public thought they knew, was cracking under the weight of truth. And as the palace, the family, and the staff struggled to navigate the aftermath, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The first wave of shock had passed, but the tsunami was on its way. Because while the world celebrated Archie's arrival, behind palace doors, the narrative had changed forever. And what came next? The private confrontations, the whispered judgments, and the subtle maneuvers would test loyalties, expose vulnerabilities, and set the stage for a scandal no one could have predicted. The birth that was meant to be a moment of joy had become the catalyst for a chain of events that would leave Meghan, Harry, and the entire royal family scrambling. And the most shocking revelations, those that would truly redefine the story, had yet to surface. But what came next would push Meghan to her emotional limits and force the royal family into decisions they never imagined, and no one saw it coming. Why would a mother risk everything to reveal her daughter's most closely guarded secret? That question hung in the air like a storm cloud as Doria Ragland made the choice to confront King Charles with the truth about Archie's birth. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was calculated, deliberate, and carried the weight of years of observation, concern, and moral conviction. But stepping forward was never just about revealing a secret. It was about forcing a reckoning, shaking the very foundation of relationships that had been carefully curated over decades. Have you ever had to make a decision that might hurt the people you love, but you knew withholding it would hurt even more? That was Doria's position, and the courage it required cannot be overstated. Doria had always been Meghan's anchor. Throughout the years of royal scrutiny, she had been the calm presence behind the camera, the soft voice in the chaos, the quiet reassurance in moments when the palace felt overwhelmingly cold and judgmental. She had watched Meghan navigate media attacks, confront biased commentary, and struggle with the unrelenting expectations placed upon her as a new member of one of the most visible families in the world. And yet, despite all of her guidance, Meghan had kept the surrogate arrangement a secret, not just from the public, but from her own family. It was a choice Doria could understand in part, but it was also one that weighed heavily on her conscience. Why? Because secrecy has consequences. A mother knows when a secret could lead to future harm. In this case, Doria feared that if the truth about Archie's birth was revealed at the wrong time, by the wrong source, or through a leak, the damage would be catastrophic. She understood the media landscape all too well. One rumor, one careless comment, and the narrative of Archie's birth could be transformed into a public scandal, overshadowing his life and tainting Meghan's carefully constructed image. So she made the decision to act first, to protect not just Meghan, but the child, and ultimately the monarchy itself. The palace corridors, silent and polished as ever, were not accustomed to such revelations. Staff members noticed the unusual tension, the subtle shift in Meghan's demeanor, and the presence of Doria, who had come not as a visitor, but as a bearer of truth. A mother's intuition is a powerful force, and Doria had reached the point where silence was no longer an option. Every step she took through the corridors carried intention, every glance held meaning. She was about to enter a room that had seen countless discussions of protocol, succession, and ceremonial matters, but never one like this. Imagine the weight of that moment, standing before King Charles, knowing that what you were about to say could change the dynamics of the family forever. This was not a conversation about protocol or tradition. It was a conversation about trust, honesty, and the bonds that hold a family together. Doria's words would not be easy for Meghan to hear, either. Mothers know the power of their voice, and Doria used it deliberately. She framed her revelation not as a judgment, but as an unflinching truth, one that demanded acknowledgement and reflection. When Doria finally spoke, Meghan's initial reaction was one of disbelief. The room, thick with the tension of unspoken truths, became a crucible of emotion. Tears flowed, breaths caught, and the reality of exposure hit like a tidal wave. Meghan's tears were not just about fear. They were about realization, the sudden confrontation with the consequences of secrecy. Every decision she had made, every narrative she had controlled, every media-friendly image was suddenly overshadowed by the stark, unyielding truth. The surrogate arrangement was no longer just her secret. It was known, it was revealed, and it had been placed squarely in the hands of her father, the king. And King Charles? His reaction was a mixture of shock, concern, and contemplation. Here was a daughter, a family member, someone he loved, revealing a truth he had no prior knowledge of. How do you process something like that? What do you do when a carefully maintained story about lineage, family, and tradition is suddenly contradicted? Charles's instinct was to protect, to mediate, to understand, but the stakes were immense. This was not merely a family drama. It was a moment that could influence public perception, media narratives, and the stability of the monarchy itself. The palace staff, those silent observers, could feel the tension radiating from the room. Every subtle movement, every choice of words, was scrutinized. What had always been private, the bond between mother and daughter, the decisions about a child, was now entangled in a web of familial duty, institutional expectation, and personal morality. And in that moment, it became clear that Doria had stepped into uncharted territory. Her revelation was both an act of love and an assertion of moral responsibility. It was a calculated disruption designed to bring truth to the forefront before it became a scandal. But why now? Why had Doria waited? The answer lies in her understanding of timing and consequence. She knew that revealing the surrogate arrangement earlier could have caused panic, misunderstandings, or worse, an uncontrolled leak. She waited until she believed that Meghan could handle the emotional impact and that King Charles would process the information with both gravity and discretion. Timing, in this context, was everything. Doria's decision to speak was not impulsive. It was precise, deliberate, and born from a deep understanding of both human nature and the pressures of royal life. The implications of Doria's revelation were enormous. For Meghan, it was an emotional reckoning. For Harry, it was a challenge to navigate loyalty to his wife versus loyalty to family. For King Charles, it was a balancing act between paternal love and the responsibilities of leadership. And for the palace, it was a silent crisis, a situation that demanded careful management, discretion, and strategic thinking. Every individual in that room had to consider not just immediate emotional reactions, but the long-term impact on relationships, reputation, and the legacy of the monarchy itself. Emotions were raw. Meghan's tears were visible, but beneath them lay fear, guilt, and anxiety. Fear of public scrutiny, guilt over keeping the secret, anxiety about her relationship with her father. And at the same time, there was a sense of inevitability. Some truths, once known, cannot be unlearned. Meghan had to face the reality that the narrative she had controlled for months, or even years, was now subject to interpretation, debate, and judgment. Doria's presence was both comforting and confronting. She offered a steady hand, a measured voice, and a moral anchor. But her revelation also carried an undeniable force. The truth, once spoken, cannot be ignored. Meghan's reaction oscillated between gratitude, fear, and frustration. Gratitude that her mother had protected her in so many ways. Fear that the truth would ripple outward and affect more than just the immediate family. Frustration that the narrative she had cultivated, polished, and controlled was now in jeopardy. And the ripple effects were immediate. Staff who had observed the conversation began to speculate in whispers. Advisors were suddenly aware of a complication they had not anticipated. King Charles had to consider not just the emotional impact on Meghan, but also the institutional consequences of this revelation. Public perception, media narratives, and future protocol were all suddenly part of a complex puzzle that demanded attention, strategy, and careful handling. As the conversation continued, Meghan's tears slowly transitioned into an emotional reckoning. She confronted the reality that her choice to use a surrogate, a choice she had believed necessary, private, and protective, had consequences that extended far beyond her intentions. How does one reconcile personal choices with institutional expectations? How does a mother navigate secrecy when that secrecy intersects with public life, media attention, and family legacy? These questions were not hypothetical for Meghan. They were immediate, pressing, and emotionally consuming. At the same time, King Charles grappled with his role in this revelation. As a father, he was protective. As a monarch, he was strategic. As an observer, he had to maintain composure, weighing emotional reactions against institutional stability. And as the conversation progressed, it became increasingly clear that Doria's revelation had shifted the balance of power, expectation, and trust. Nothing would ever be the same. And while Meghan and King Charles navigated this storm, Harry was left to reconcile his own position. Loyal to his wife, yet aware of the implications for the family, he faced impossible choices. Could he support Meghan without alienating his father? Could he manage his own emotions while acting as a mediator in a situation charged with secrecy, fear, and moral complexity? His role, like everyone else's, was now profoundly complicated. But Doria's decision was unshakable. She had stepped forward because the truth mattered more than comfort, because morality outweighed convenience, and because the consequences of silence were far greater than the temporary discomfort of disclosure. She understood the gravity of her actions. And while Meghan struggled to process the revelation, the ripple effects of that single decision had already begun to spread, setting the stage for a series of events that would engulf the family, the palace, and the world watching. The room that had been silent, tense, and emotionally charged began to crack under the weight of unspoken implications. Meghan's tears were just the beginning. The conversation between mother and daughter, private yet loaded with monumental significance, had sparked a chain reaction. The secret, now out in part, would not stay contained. Questions, doubts, and tensions would ripple outward, affecting not just personal relationships but public perception, institutional trust, and the fragile balance of royal protocol. And as the first shockwave settled, it became clear that the revelation was far from over. Because while Meghan had faced the immediate emotional consequences of Doria's disclosure, the broader implications, the whispers, the potential leaks, the scrutiny, were only just beginning. And the next move, whether by Meghan, Harry, or King Charles, would determine how the family navigated the fallout, the press, and the inevitable public confrontation. The mother had stepped forward. The secret had been revealed, and the stage was set for a series of confrontations, decisions, and revelations that would redefine everything. But what came next, the full impact of Doria's revelation on Meghan, Harry, and the monarchy, was about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted, and it would leave the entire palace reeling. Have you ever imagined a secret so personal, so delicate, that revealing it could change the course of not just your life, but the lives of everyone around you? For Meghan Markle, the revelation of Prince Archie's birth via surrogate was exactly that. A truth so seismic it threatened to disrupt her carefully crafted image, her relationships with the royal family, and the narrative that the world had come to believe. The word surrogate in any context is loaded, but in the context of the monarchy, lineage, and centuries of tradition, it became explosive. How does a private family decision turn into a historical scandal overnight? That is the story we are about to uncover. From the outside, the birth of Prince Archie was celebrated as a moment of pure joy, a fairy tale addition to the royal lineage. Headlines proclaimed the arrival of the baby, photos captured Meghan glowing with maternal pride, and the public believed in the narrative laid before them. Yet, behind the scenes, the reality was vastly different. Meghan had not carried Archie herself, a surrogate had. The choice to use a surrogate was deeply personal, rooted in complex considerations, health, privacy, and the intense pressures of royal life. But it was a secret so tightly held that even close members of the family, including King Charles, were unaware. Think about the implications for a moment. In the monarchy, births are not just personal milestones. They are symbolic events with public, political, and dynastic significance. Every detail matters. The lineage, the timing, the announcement, all are meticulously managed. Meghan's decision to use a surrogate, while entirely her own, challenged centuries of protocol, and introducing that truth could have caused a ripple effect with unimaginable consequences. And yet, she kept it hidden, convinced that the surrogate's role was her private matter. The irony? The very secrecy she relied upon would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations within the palace. Doria Ragland's role in this revelation cannot be overstated. As Meghan's mother, she had been aware of the surrogate arrangement for some time. She understood the reasons behind it, the careful orchestration of appearances, and the emotional and psychological pressures her daughter was under. But Doria also understood the stakes, the moral obligation to be honest with the family, especially with King Charles. The choice to step forward was not about judgment or betrayal. It was about truth. And truth, in this case, carried the weight of seismic consequences. So why was the surrogate arrangement kept a secret in the first place? There were multiple factors at play. First, public perception. Meghan knew that any hint of deviation from the conventional narrative could spark media speculation, criticism, and scrutiny. Second, family dynamics. She feared the judgment or misunderstanding from the royal family if the truth were revealed prematurely. Third, control. Like any high-profile figure under constant observation, Meghan wanted to control the narrative, presenting only what she deemed necessary to maintain privacy and dignity. But controlling a narrative in the palace is a near-impossible task. Secrets have a way of emerging, and when they do, the consequences can be catastrophic. The surrogate herself remained a shadowed figure throughout this entire process. Carefully selected, discreet, and highly professional, she delivered Archie without drawing public attention. Every medical appointment, every step in the process, was orchestrated to maintain privacy. Staff, aides, and even select advisors were aware only in fragments, told only what they needed to know. And yet, even with all these precautions, the weight of secrecy was immense. Secrets, by their very nature, are fragile. And the more important the secret, the higher the stakes when it is finally revealed. Imagine the private conversations that led to this decision. Meghan consulting with doctors, lawyers, advisors, and her mother. The careful weighing of risks, the deep concern for Archie's well-being, and the anxiety about how the family and public would perceive it. The surrogate's role was designed to protect, to ensure safety, and to shield Meghan from the intense scrutiny of pregnancy in the public eye. Yet every decision, no matter how calculated, carried emotional and relational consequences. Secrets within a family, especially one as visible as the royal family, have a unique potency. They ripple, they shift, and eventually, they demand to be acknowledged. And acknowledge it Doria did. The confrontation with King Charles was intense. Picture it, a mother, calm yet resolute, revealing a truth that could not be ignored. Her words were precise, measured, yet carried an undeniable force. She did not deliver them to shame Meghan, nor to provoke conflict. She spoke because the truth had become unavoidable. The surrogate had given life to a royal heir, and the monarchy had the right, if not the obligation, to understand the circumstances fully. The revelation forced Meghan to face both personal and institutional consequences at the same time. What was Meghan's reaction? Initially, shock, then guilt, then fear. Her composure, so carefully maintained in public appearances, melted away in the private intensity of the conversation. Tears flowed freely, not just from embarrassment, but from the profound understanding that her carefully controlled narrative had been disrupted. Every media-friendly image, every interview, every public gesture was suddenly overshadowed by the weight of revelation. It was not a scandal in the traditional sense, at least not yet, but it had the potential to become one. King Charles's reaction was equally complex. As a father, he felt a mixture of concern, disappointment, and paternal protectiveness. As a monarch, he weighed the institutional implications. How would the public react if this truth became widely known? How would it affect the perception of lineage and tradition? And most crucially, how should he support his daughter while maintaining the integrity of the monarchy? The palace had dealt with crises before, but this was unique. It was deeply personal, morally complex, and emotionally charged. Meanwhile, Meghan's advisors were scrambling behind the scenes. How do you manage a revelation of this magnitude? How do you guide a family through the fallout while protecting both individual and institutional interests? The surrogate, the secrecy, and the emotional consequences created a multi-layered problem that required careful orchestration. And yet, despite every attempt at strategy, there was a human element that could not be controlled: emotion. The confrontation, the tears, the tension. It was raw, unpredictable, and utterly real. The media, though not yet aware of the full truth, would eventually play a critical role. In the palace, whispers of speculation were already beginning. Staff members, family members, and advisors all recognized that secrets in such a high-profile environment are rarely contained. One slip, one hint, one leaked detail could spiral into a worldwide conversation, with public opinion, social media, and journalists amplifying the story. The tension of anticipation, the possibility that the world would soon know, added another layer of pressure to Meghan's already heavy emotional load. And then there was Harry. Loyal, protective, and caught in the middle of the revelation, he faced an impossible balancing act. Should he defend Meghan publicly or privately? Should he confront family members or remain a mediator? His emotions were a mixture of concern for Meghan, anxiety about family reactions, and apprehension about public perception. Every choice carried consequence, and in the delicate ecosystem of palace life, even a single misstep could escalate into a crisis. The surrogate secret also introduced ethical and emotional dimensions that went beyond logistics. It raised questions about trust, transparency, and the role of secrecy in relationships. For Meghan, it was a matter of personal autonomy and protection. For Doria, it was a matter of honesty and moral responsibility. For King Charles, it was a test of his ability to balance paternal love with institutional duty. And for Harry, it was a test of loyalty, strategy, and emotional intelligence. Every individual's reaction had ripple effects, and the consequences were already beginning to unfold. As the hours passed after Doria's disclosure, Meghan confronted the reality of public and private fallout simultaneously. Her tears, her anxiety, and her fear were compounded by the knowledge that once a secret like this is revealed to the family, it can never be undone. How do you rebuild trust after a secret is exposed? How do you navigate relationships when the foundations have shifted? Meghan faced these questions head-on, grappling with the complex intersection of personal choice, family loyalty, and public expectation. The palace, meanwhile, operated in its usual measured way, outwardly calm but internally tense. Advisors whispered in corridors, staff observed subtle gestures, and every member of the inner circle recognized the potential for the secret to become public. It was a high-stakes environment where every action had implications. The surrogate revelation was not merely a private family matter. It was a catalyst for institutional tension, media speculation, and emotional upheaval. And yet, for all the strategy, protocol, and foresight, one truth remained. Secrets in a family this public are rarely contained for long. The more important the secret, the more inevitable the exposure. Doria had acted with intention and care, but the consequences of her revelation would extend far beyond that private moment. It would shape the family dynamic, affect public perception, and create pressure points that could explode in ways no one could predict. Because the surrogate secret was not just a logistical detail. It was a human story, a story of maternal concern, of familial trust, of secrecy, and of the consequences of choices made in isolation. Meghan's tears, Doria's courage, and King Charles's careful navigation were all part of a complex tapestry, one that was about to unravel in increasingly dramatic ways. And as Meghan struggled to process the revelation, one question loomed over the palace. How would the world react when this secret, once private and carefully guarded, inevitably became public? And more importantly, how would Meghan reconcile the emotional, familial, and institutional consequences of a truth she had tried to control for so long? Because the surrogate secret was only the beginning. And what came next would challenge everything Meghan thought she could protect, forcing confrontations and decisions that would shake the royal family to its core. But the most shocking revelations about this secret were still waiting, and no one could predict the chaos they would unleash. What happens when a secret this explosive hits the most tightly controlled family in the world? Imagine the walls of the palace, polished and gleaming, suddenly echoing with whispers, anxious glances, and unspoken questions. The birth of Prince Archie had already been celebrated as a fairy tale event, but the revelation of the surrogate arrangement turned the palace into a pressure cooker of emotion, protocol, and uncertainty. Behind closed doors, the reactions were immediate, intense, and often contradictory. How does a monarchy, built on tradition and carefully maintained narratives, process a truth that disrupts everything it stands for? King Charles was the first to fully grasp the weight of the revelation. A father, aware that his daughter's tears signaled not just fear, but deep emotional turmoil, he balanced paternal concern with the demands of being the sovereign. This was more than a private family matter. It was a challenge to the narrative of continuity, lineage, and legitimacy. Charles had always tried to bridge the gap between modernity and tradition, but even he was momentarily unprepared for a disclosure that merged both private emotion and public consequence. How do you protect your child while protecting an institution that spans centuries? That tension filled every inch of the room. Meghan, still in shock, oscillated between gratitude for her mother's courage and fear of the consequences. Doria had delivered the truth with precision and care, but the moment it landed, Meghan's carefully curated composure dissolved. Tears, trembling hands, and the tremor in her voice reflected the profound emotional stakes. She had kept the surrogate secret for reasons she believed justifiable, but now the truth had reached the king, and the palace's delicate equilibrium was fractured. The very act of revealing a secret intended to protect had created chaos. Prince Harry, loyal to Meghan yet deeply aware of the implications for the family, experienced his own private conflict. He had stood by her in public, defended her from critics, and managed the pressures of royal life. But this revelation was different. It was intimate, unprecedented, and morally complex. How do you support your spouse when the consequences of her actions ripple through generations and institutions? Harry's heart was with Meghan, but his mind was occupied with strategy, damage control, and the reality that this secret, now known to King Charles, would inevitably find its way into the world. The palace staff, although trained to maintain discretion, were also affected. These are individuals who have spent years observing the meticulous choreography of royal life. They are acutely aware of the power of a single revelation. Whispers spread in corridors, subtle glances communicated alarm, and advisors quietly adjusted their plans. Even without direct involvement, they felt the tension, a mixture of anxiety, fear, and curiosity. The palace had faced scandals before, but nothing quite like this, an intimate truth about birth, family, and secrecy that no one had anticipated. Meanwhile, Doria Ragland maintained her composure. Her courage was remarkable. She had made the choice to speak because she believed it was necessary for truth and moral clarity. She understood the fallout, yet she also understood that silence would create far greater harm over time. The way she presented the surrogate revelation to King Charles was deliberate, calm, factual, and unyielding in its moral imperative. This was not about judgment. It was about confronting reality. And as the room absorbed her words, the ripple effects began to spread through every corner of the palace. Consider the emotional tension between Meghan and her father. The tears, the vulnerability, the unspoken fear, all of it reflected the unique complexity of parent-child relationships magnified by public life. King Charles felt the weight of dual responsibilities. He wanted to comfort and protect his daughter, yet he also needed to maintain the stability and credibility of the monarchy. Every facial expression, every pause, every choice of words carried layers of meaning. How do you navigate love, duty, and the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny simultaneously? In private, advisors began strategizing. Damage control, public statements, and managing the narrative became immediate priorities. Even though the public had not yet learned the secret, palace insiders recognized that controlling the story before it leaked was essential. They discussed the logistics of managing media inquiries, anticipating social media speculation, and preparing the royal family for potential questions from journalists and pundits. Every detail mattered because, in the world of royalty, perception is reality. Yet, amidst the strategy and planning, emotion remained uncontainable. Meghan's fear was palpable, Harry's loyalty was tested, and King Charles's paternal concern collided with his institutional responsibility. This was not a moment that could be managed purely by protocol or public relations. It was a human crisis, one where empathy, moral judgment, and personal bonds intersected with centuries of tradition. How does a father process a truth that changes his perception of events he believed he understood? How does a wife and mother face scrutiny while protecting a personal secret that has now been revealed to someone she loves?